Can you feel that? That's the wind of change blowing. The weatherman said that there's a storm coming.
Let me show you something. This is from the 2012 election, as GSS data on the 2016 election isn't available yet. In the 2012 election, we can see how people who call themselves liberals of any race voted, then how self-described moderates voted, and here we have how self-described conservatives voted. Now, fair enough, it is Obama versus Romney, but the racial disparity here should make it plain that blacks and to a lesser degree Hispanics put race over belief. This is true when you control for position on specific issues as well. When looking at a position on abortion, when looking at position on a gay marriage, when looking at the position on the size of government, even when looking at the position on wealth redistribution, except for Hispanics. Hispanics who opposed wealth redistribution just barely gave the nod to Romney. For blacks, even blacks who believe the Republican Party helps blacks more than the Democrat Party does, are more likely to identify with the Democrat Party. Even blacks who think the government is spending too much to improve the conditions of blacks identify as Democrat. In the case of blacks who are conservative Republicans, who think the Republican Party helps blacks more than the Democrat Party does, and who think that we're spending too much on blacks, they still vote Democrat. In the case of Hispanics, the situation is not as dire, but still, this idea that if you get other groups to agree with your policy that they'll vote for you, well, how about you first figure out if they'll vote for you even if they agree with you? It may seem like they would, a rational person would, but we're dealing with people, not necessarily rational actors, and people behave in ways. I haven't looked at as granular a level in the UK or Canada, but in the UK, non-whites voted Labour 52 to 33 overall, or 61% of the vote between those two parties. Blacks in the UK voted 76% Labour of the vote just between Labour and Tory. I couldn't find exit poll data for Canada, but in the 33 ridings, similar to House districts, that had non-white majorities, 30 of them, or 90.1% of them, elected the Liberal Party. Different racial groups consider themselves to be citizens of the world over being citizens of the United States. 55% of blacks in the US think this way. 46.8% of Hispanics think this way. 59.6% of US classified Asians think this way, but only 27% of whites think this way. When asked to rate their top 3 identifiers, millennial blacks, Asians, and Hispanics were more likely to pick race over nationality. In fact, they picked race over anything else. 80% of the time, blacks picked race as one of their top 3, Hispanics 69%, but whites only 40%. That said, even whites, or at least millennial whites, were more likely to pick race than they were to pick American. Even though this is all just millennials, it portends. And ideology lost to race in every group. The term idiot originally meant someone who didn't engage in politics or someone who kept to himself. From Wikipedia, quote, "Idiot is a word derived from the Greek idiotes, person lacking professional skill, a private citizen, individual, from idios, private, one's own. In ancient Greece, people who were not capable of engaging in the public sphere were considered idiotes, in contrast to the public citizen or polites. An idiot in Athenian democracy was someone who was characterized by self-centeredness and concerned almost exclusively with private as opposed to public affairs. Idiocy was the natural state of ignorance into which all persons were born, and its opposite, citizenship, was affected through formalized education. In Athenian democracy, idiots were born and citizens were made through education, although citizenship was also largely hereditary. Declining to take part in public life, such as Democrat government of the polis city-state, was considered dishonorable. Now, it's important to remember that politics referred to affairs of the polis. This originally meant literally the city, but grew to include affairs of a larger state. But let's say that instead of dealing in race, you were insistent upon not dealing in race, and you ignored race. You instead focused on abstract notions of rights for the individual, what is ethical, and all these big-brained ideas. Are you a philosopher for thinking in these abstractions instead of thinking in proper nouns? Sure, maybe, whatever, call yourself whatever you want. But here's what you absolutely are: an idiot trying to dig through the side of a cliff with a needle, because you're not involved in the affairs of the polis. You're off in your own little world of forms, and you poo-poo the world outside. That's identity politics. That's beneath me. No, that's just politics. You might as well be playing video games. In fact, you would do a lot less harm if you just went and did video games instead of lolbirding all over the place. When you're hanging out over here instead of over here, and then say, I'm really into politics, do you see how that's dubious? Sure, technically non-identity politics is still politics, but it's marginal. It's tangential to the main fight that's going on, which is over here. Not the world of forms, but the world of proper nouns. There's no such thing as identity politics. That's just politics. It's this non-identity politics that is the aberration, and that needs to be labeled. Whites have been made to think that being proud of who they are and that advocating for the interests of their own race is somehow evil. This puts them at a huge disadvantage to the other races. It nerfs any opposition they have to their group being exploited, because any opposition has to be couched in the language of principles and all this world of forms crap, and so it's convoluted, and a whole bunch of whites become convinced of anti-white racism. And then, on top of this, the lolberts come along and build up rationalizations for their own mental prison that they were bullied into, that they were first bullied into not being racist, with a bunch of emotional blackmail and some fake and dramatized history, decontextualized history about slavery and segregation, and then later rationalize that prison with all sorts of big-brained philosophy and principles, quote unquote. We're trying to break people out of this mental prison, which is white self-hate and guilt being pushed by false history. Right to birth control. That's about tweaking the conservative Christians. Anything involving taxes or entitlements, that's about race. Abortion, okay, that's not about race. That may be a non-identity politics issue. Immigration, that's about race. School policy and funding may or may not be about race depending on the level of government, but as a general issue, school funding disparity, that's all about race. Government worker pay and benefits, that's about a real group of people who vote and block up as a group for benefits as government workers. The military, the police, even firefighters are just dripping with identity. So sometimes it's not about race, but even then it's still about identifiable groups with collective interests collectively bargaining. Whites in West Virginia voting for Romney supposedly against their economic interests. Why would that happen? Well, because they're white, because race identity. Even if Mitt Romney is so big-brained that he would scoff at such low reasoning. The weird thing is non-identity politics. The domain of think tank people, that's all it is. How much better off would we be if they took their terrible trivium and focused it on building model airplanes or ships in bottles instead of trying to reinforce the mental prison that white people are in? It's not benign. It's a very damaging thing. I hear people say these dumb things like, you can't deny abortion and then be against benefits for single moms, or you can't support open borders and a welfare state. And I get the cause and effect arguments in these statements. Believe me, I used to make them, but it's not true. People can and do support open borders and big welfare, even though one thing exacerbates the problems of the others. It's not like you point out a contradiction and people start to tick and then explode. They'll just ignore it. You can't support freedom of religion and then support what was done at Waco and Ruby Ridge. Watch them. They just did. People can and do make apparent contradictions all the time, and it doesn't matter. They don't care, and you're not smart for pointing them out. They don't care about facts. They're black. They don't care about facts. You're white. They evolved in the context of group conflict and what works in group conflict. And what works is group solidarity and closing ranks in the struggle against enemy groups. And truth only matters if it can help in that struggle. One thing that's really just swell about these principled people is how they live by their principles while everyone else just uses that. For example, the Republican Party being against welfare use and being for free markets. So what happens is that when Democrats win, all of their voters get money in all sorts of ways at the expense of the people who voted against them. This can be done by doing things that result in rural areas paying more for urban areas, welfare laws that work out so that really they only benefit classes of people that vote overwhelmingly Democrat. There's all sorts of ways you can do this. The Republicans, however, are to be more principled. When your Republican Party wins, Mr. Whitey, well, you then get the privilege to endure the rigor of the free market. Nothing gets taken from your opponents, even though when they win, stuff gets taken from you. Of course, when you act this way, you're not actually being principled. This isn't principled behavior. This is just being a chump, because the principle only works if everyone abides by it. If you're the only one actually embracing the free market while everyone else is using the state to get stuff from other groups in the voting wars, well, then the principle you're actually living by is this: brown people get to benefit at the expense of white people when they win, while white people at best get a free market if they win. That's the actual principle that you're living by in the real world. Non-whites lobby aggressively for members of their groups to get jobs, to get positions of power, while whites are told not to be so crude and think about the ideas and having the best man for the job. And the result is that non-whites get overrepresentation above their level of merit, above what they should be in a meritocracy, while white people just get shafted and their principles actually lose out as a result. So let's leave the world of forms and get real. Who are the people you're advocating for? Who are the people who will support you? What is the flesh and blood material that will back you up and that you will back up? Morality and ethics are just your feelings. People have feelings about fairness in the context of their individual, their family, and their wider group. There's no reason for any of it to have any, inherent truth or total internal consistency. What is the evolutionary value of a perfectly internally consistent ethic? Does having a totally internally consistent ethic help in making babies? Let's try this. Most big brain philosophy people have the distinction between moral agents and non-moral agents. Okay, there you go. There are no moral agents. Everyone's an animal. And they know how to posture as a moral agent, but vanishingly few will follow you into philosophy land. Don't fall for it. He's just going to drag you into his funhouse until you figure out that he's just a red racist, that he's just an anti-white. And for all the brown people, why would they want to end up in the same mess that you're in? When white people engage in politics, they got what they wanted. They got big empires in their own spaces. When white people disengaged from politics, that's when the elite were able to throw one over on whites and grant black citizenship in the chaos at the end of the Civil War, and then later to open up the borders to the Hispanics and Asians. Today, brown people have a great thing going. They're getting much more of what they want by engaging in politics, not by wasting time, not by being an idiot, not by drifting off into the world of forms. So I'm sorry, you're not going to convince them to be idiots like you and join in your loser club. White people need to come up to present time, realize that they're a real people with real interests collectively in a genetic mesh, which is how the world actually operates, not trinket individualism. This is how everyone else on the planet thinks, and if you don't think like this, you're just going to lose. Two armies squaring off. One army is unified, the other is full of big-brained individualists and philosophers who deconstruct race and think that values matter more than people. Meanwhile, the orcs are charging through and wrecking your face while you sit and refuse to recognize that you're a team in battle. Of course, you have to be tactical, you have to have allies, and we can, and perhaps will, have to work with the Hispanics and Asians, and maybe even blacks if that's possible, to common ends. But the first step is to realize who you are and the struggle that you are in, and also to realize that it was putting ideas over people that created this mess that we're in.